This is the STS 133 interview with Mission Specialist Alvin Drew. Tell us about the place where you grew up, your hometown, and what it was like growing up there, and how that place influenced who you've become.
Okay. Grew up first off in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., in a place called Lanham, Maryland, in Prince George's County. And then when I was about 4, we actually moved into the city over in the northeast side of the place, in a township called Brooklyn. Probably most famous for its proximity to Catholic University and all the Catholic colleges that are around there. It was a working middle-class neighborhood, mix of white-collar and blue-collar middle-class African-Americans who were in the place. And they all had just a strong work ethic to kind of pull themselves up from the bootstraps. We had just gotten through the Civil Rights Act 1964, and opportunities were open out there, and there was a strong sense of optimism and ambition out there that they brought across. We had 2 doors up from me was a man who'd been an undertaker, and I think he recently retired from having his own funeral home. And he had started off literally as a sharecropper in Mississippi, and it worked his way up to having a good nest egg. And he was intent on beating into me the fact that I could do anything in the world I wanted to. There was no laws, there was no segregation holding me back, but I needed to have an education. Nobody could ever take education back from me, and hard work ethic and a good education would take me anywhere I wanted to go. And that was kind of the mood of the entire neighborhood around me. Everybody out there was living by that ethic, whether they were expressing it verbally or not.
Did you get a chance to see the D.C. Maryland area from space on your previous space flight?
Yeah, we got to fly over. I remember having those guys let me know we've got this world map program that has this moving "You Are Here" dot on it, right, to let me know when we were coming up on Washington, D.C., and I got about 5 minutes notice, and I ran up and took a look out there. You can pick out where the Anacostia River splits off from the Potomac, and that's probably your biggest indication that you're looking at Washington, D.C. There's no nice diamond shape around the city that lets you know where it is. It's just a gray smear from all the asphalt and concrete in the middle of the downtown that lets you know that you're looking at a city at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, what was that moment like when just kind of recognizing and realizing that, hey, I've gotten here and come from there, and I'm here 200 miles up, and I'm living this accomplishment that I've set out to do.
It's probably the same sensation when you climb a mountain or you're climbing a cliff face and you look back and you have a sense of the distance that you've covered. Up until that point, you're looking at those 3 feet in front of you, and you go there 3 feet at a time, and you look back and you've covered a few miles when it's all said and done. That same thing, that I've gone from there to here.
Okay. Every accomplishment begins with some form of motivation, and you just gave us a story about somebody motivating you. You've been an astronaut here for about 10 years. What set you off on that trek and that road to pursue this line of work?
For me, the motivation was just primal. It's like people get hungry or you get tired and you want to sleep, you want to eat. From the time I was 4 years old, I needed to fly. I remember going out to what is now Baltimore Washington International Airport to watch my dad go off on a business trip, and just absolutely obsessed with the planes I saw taking off in and out of there, and knowing then at 4 years old that that's what I wanted to do. This was September of '67. October of '68, a year later, I was in first grade watching the Apollo 7 launch on television. Our principal took out our little black and white TV and we watched that launch. And I watched that, and I was torn. Like, I need to do this too. I went home, very troubled. Asked my dad, what should I do? Should I be an astronaut or should I be a pilot? He goes, you can do both those things. All these astronauts have been pilots, and that just sealed it for me. That was what I was going to go try and do. I didn't know about the astronaut part. That seemed there weren't too many astronauts there, but I was certainly going to go fly an airplane.
Wow! So at 5 or 6 years old, that was solidified in your
It's scary to think that some kindergartner made my career choice for me. Yes.
Recount for us, if you would, the steps that you've taken in your military career to get to the NASA Astronaut Corps.
Military career started with the Air Force Academy back in 1980. I went there because if I wasn't going to necessarily fly spacecraft, I wanted to design them. One of of my heroes at that point was Clarence Kelly Johnson, who made the SR-71 and several other planes for Lockheed. And if I couldn't fly planes, which I would still wanted to do but didn't think was necessarily possible, this was a place to do it, one of the foremost aeronautical and astronautical engineering schools in the country. I got out there and I was being recruited by the physics department to become a physics major. And one of the instructors there mapped it out for me and just trying to give me why I should want to be a physics major. He said, you get a technical degree, like physics, get a great grade point average coming out of the Air Force Academy, go to pilot training, become a decent pilot, and if you've got a good grade point average and you're a decent pilot, you can go to test pilot school and become a test pilot. And from there, it says, who knows? All of our current Air Force astronauts are test pilots. And he had just mapped that out with flagstones for me, and that's about what I did. I came out of the Air Force Academy with degrees in physics and astronautical engineering. I went off to become a pilot, flying helicopters, first in combat rescue and special operations. Eventually, I went to jet pilot training and then to the Navy Test Pilot School. I served most of the 90s as a test pilot, and in coming for the class of 2000, I applied to become an astronaut.
Okay. Tell me about some of the time you spent as a combat helicopter pilot.
They were exciting. I was in at the very inception of what is now the Air Force Special Operations Command. Obviously, I wasn't paying attention. I didn't know it was coming until they hauled us out one day for a parade and says, "You're now the Air Force Special Operations Command." That's good. Well, just a few short months later, we were going into Panama to go and bring back Manuel Noriega, and that was going to be my first few combat missions doing that, and things just never quite calmed down after that. We were always somewhere in the world in the middle of some type of scrape and special operations, because they're the ones you send if you're short of a full war where you're doing things. But even when there was warfare going on, as there was in the first Gulf War over by Saudi Arabia, we were in the middle of that as well. So a year later, I was seeing combat missions over Saudi Arabia and Kuwait.
Wow. That sounds pretty intense.
It was a good few years, but it wasn't something I'd do for 20 years. It was a burnout job.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you recall the time of getting the call of hey, do you want to come down and be an astronaut? Do you have a story about what that was like when you got that call?
Yeah, ironically enough, that was 10 years ago yesterday.
Wow.
I got a call from our deputy center director, who just retired recently as a Kennedy Space Center director, asking if I was interested in coming out to be an astronaut. And I'm trying to contain myself and sound calm. So I told him, I said, if I'd make a joke, I said, I could come to like a job like that. Maybe I'll sign up and go ahead and do that. So, well, come on here, let me know how it grows on you. And then I hung up the phone, closed the door to my office, and jumped up and down.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
Tell us how you would characterize the value of education in your life and what it's enabled you to do.
Education's been in my family's DNA. My family grew up in Washington, D.C. My parents were met at Dunbar High School, which back in the late 40s, around 1950s, was one of the first attempts at a magnet school. The schools were segregated back then, and for African American students who were excelling, that was where they would send these children there, the students. It was also a place for African Americans who had degrees, PhDs, who were waiting for their opportunity to teach at Howard University to go and make their bones, to show their credentials. And so my parents were people who were aspiring to become college professors, were teaching them. So you'd have a guy who was with a PhD teaching them freshman chemistry. And they had some of the best education they possibly could have, and they saw that as a ticket for them to get out of poverty within the city. And so by the time I came around, we were living a middle-class existence based on the tickets they had earned from their education, and it was sure that my sisters, my brother, and I were all going to get education. So it was expected that we were going to go to college. It was expected that we were going to get good grades, or at least give them the best possible effort. We understood that, and my mother was a teacher in school. My father, after a career both in government and in private industry, once he retired, went and became a history teacher in high school. They held that whole thing in very high regard. And they sent us to schools with some of the best teachers in the city. And so I got exposed to some of the best teachers, and so I had a good appreciation for what good teaching and good education could do.
Okay. You've flown once before. Tell us about what experiences stand out most in your mind about that whole trip from the launch to being up on orbit to the return. What sticks out in your mind about that
A
experience?
few things come to mind. First was we had a few guest stars on our mission. They were astronauts on our crew, but obviously their influence went well beyond that. First and foremost among them was Barb Morgan. Barb, as you know, was the first runner-up for Krista McAuliffe for Teachers in Space for the flight aboard Challenger back in 1986. I think that if anything happened to Krista, she would have been on that flight, and it was clear that had the program continued, she would have been her successor, would have been the next teacher to go up in space. As it turned out, ironically, she would be the next teacher to go up on a space shuttle 22 years later. And the inspiring part of that journey obviously had a lot of the media's attention, and it was good to actually work with Barbara and see this media superstar, but then just this very unassuming lady who was just fun to work with on a crew, despite the historical burden that was on her shoulders. The other one was Dave Williams, one of our Canadian astronauts who had done very well here at Johnson Space Center, had ran a large part of the science directorate here, and Canada, if nothing else, they're very enthusiastic about space travel and aeronautics and aerospace, and they're enthusiastic about those among them who do extremely well. And Dave filled both those squares, and so we had lots of attention focused on Dave Williams as well. So that was the part running up to the flight. The actual launch was exciting.
Yeah.
It was the very first flight for Endeavour after it had been through an extensive refurb. It seemed like a brand new spaceship, and so we were just making sure that it got a good shakedown on its way to orbit, literally. And when I got to orbit, the part that sticks out most in my mind from that mission was about an hour and a half into the mission, because I had launched on the middeck and didn't get to see the launch. I was taping down a coaxial cable for our internet, and it was the first time I actually gotten up to a window. And of course, you're very busy during that time. I actually took a few seconds just to go look out the window at what was the Chihuahuan Desert over in Mexico. And at that moment, a satellite passed between me and the Earth.
Wow.
And I don't think very many astronauts get a chance to see any other body besides maybe the Hubble or the space station, but just some other random satellite. And that was when my thought was, we're not in Kansas anymore. I'm looking down on top of satellites passing beneath me. It was one of those moments, just to see the Earth, the curvature of the Earth, that breathtaking moment, and have it punctuated by that conjunction between us and that satellite, just stuck with me.
Okay. All veteran crew on STS-133. Everybody has flown before. You've got 3 crew members who've actually spent time up on station as long-duration crew members. How much of a benefit will that be to having that experience help in accomplishing this mission?
Let's go one step beyond that. There's going to be 6 space station crew members up there when we dock the space station. So by the time we get there, Steve Lindsay, Eric Bowe, and I will be the 3 members who have had no experience on board space station. 9 other crew members out there who will know where everything is, where everything's stowed, how everything works, and so we'll see them as kind of our seeing eye crew members to help us around.
Yeah.
They'll be extremely valuable to have. I liken it to trying to go up Mount Everest without a Sherpa. These guys are the folks who know where all the trails are and how to get to places. So I think that it was just a coup that we decided to start reflying space station veterans on board space shuttle missions because that they're so much more efficient on board the space station when they get there.
The content of the mission has changed a lot since you first started training, still changing as we speak. What kind of challenge has that been for the crew to have to deal with that, and what kinds of adjustments have you had to make because everything is changing almost constantly?
It hasn't been that big a challenge. We understood at the beginning of this that our mission was going to be in flux. When we first signed us up for this, we were the very last shuttle mission, and we knew that as things did or did not get done on previous shuttle missions to ours, that things would go on to and off of our task list because we were going to be the last chance to get certain things done. Now, since then, we moved in the second to last spot, and we've added 2 spacewalks. And our attitude was like, well, when it comes along, we'll go with the flow. The big picture content really hasn't changed that much. The main part of our mission to bring up Leonardo, the pressurized multipurpose module, and our Express Logistics Carrier 4 with the radiator, has stayed the same. So that core, so everything else has been around the periphery of the mission, and really hasn't rocked our waters too much, even though there's this continuous churn.
Okay. Tell me about how you would characterize the contributions of the thousands of people who work behind the scenes to ensure the success of the mission and the safety of the crew for every mission?
For me, every time I get to work with the whole greater community that's around STS-133 and Utilization Flight 5 on the space station, I'm always a little bit envious. How do they do these things? And I work with Mission Control, and these guys are been working for years to get themselves to the point where they're in the front rooms and back rooms, and the way they converge on solutions to problems, like you've seen in Apollo 13. We've seen miniature versions of that every time we do a simulation run. And to watch those guys work in such great concert together every time under some pretty strenuous conditions impresses me. The folks at the Cape who put this orbiter together, and the thousands and thousands of hours of touch labor to refurbish the shuttle and turn it around for another flight. For me, it's always been a certain fascination with people who make something out of nothing. Metalsmiths, carpenters, artisans, and this is what these guys do. And you talk to them, and they don't seem to get it. It's like, well, I'm just the guy who puts your reaction control system tank back in here or works on your main engines. Like, yeah, but I can't do that. I don't know how you do that. And these guys come in every day with just a sense of dedication and pride in what they do. And it's just, we're just down at the Cape for our first review of the orbiter and looking at the condition that it's in and then the pride these people have in their work. It's really great to see that. It's also the folks in the program office who work budgets and schedules and everything else. And watching that whole thing go in concert, it amazes me that it works at all, much less how well it works. And I think it's just because that sense of mission and pride that everybody brings to work with them every day.
If your launch schedule holds, you're scheduled to be on board the space station right around the time of the 10th anniversary of the arrival of Expedition 1. That crew established continuous human presence on the space station. Discuss, if you would, the significance of that milestone that they accomplished and the future of a space station to space exploration.
Okay. The milestone, what keeps coming back to my mind when I think about that was where Neil Armstrong's work when he stepped on the moon. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. 250 miles into space isn't very far. I mean, it's a longer drive to Dallas. But you have to practice in your backyard what you're going to do on the other side of the world. We learned everything we were going to do on the moon right here in low Earth orbit. We practiced it here and then we pushed out. If we're going to go and live places like the moon or Mars and beyond, we need to have figured out how we're going to live off this planet where we're not that far away from, as John Young described, as a can of beans. Mm-hmm. And this was a place we're going to do that. We're going to have this outpost in space, 250 miles up, and we're going to keep it continuously inhabited and for as long as we possibly can. And this is coming up on 10 years, and it's a small step in terms of distance. It's a giant leap. And it's been a giant leap since we first started doing this. This was the next giant leap into space after the moon. We're working internationally. We're working with people who don't speak our language as their primary language. They don't even use our same measurement systems. They don't have the same culture. And sometimes the first time we put these components together for the first is on orbit. And it's working. We've never brought a piece back from space, knock on wood, because it didn't work, because it didn't fit the right way. This has been a major milestone, and when I look back, because I was here when that first mission went up, how much we've learned, how much smarter we are now 10 years later after continuously operating and constructing this vehicle in space than we were then. I would say that we're much better prepared for pushing out into the solar system and living there for long periods of time than we could have ever dreamed of back in 1998.
Give us, if you would, just a nutshell bulleted list of the key objectives of STS-133.
In a nutshell, the big thing is to outfit and resupply the space station. If this were a home or a structure like on the ground that happens to be in space, the analogy would be that we're putting a new walk-in closet permanently attached to the space station, this permanent multi-purpose module, and we're going to put a new either storage platform or deck out there outside the express logistics carrier carrying a spare radiator, a new air conditioner, a spare air conditioner for the place. Those are the big objectives, and everything else we're doing outside for these spacewalks is repair. This is 2 6.5-hour episodes of This Old Station, fixing up things that have gotten old in the 10 years they've been up there in space. And that's about, those are the big objectives for this mission.
Okay. And tell us, if you would, some of your key responsibilities on the mission as Mission Specialist 1.
As Mission Specialist 1, I will be on the flight deck for Ascent, a glorified flight engineer, helping out with the rest of the crew during the 8.5-minute ride to orbit and the subsequent hour of the orbital adjustments. After that, the next couple of days I'll spend with Steve Lindsay and Eric Bowe working the Space Shuttle's robotic arm to do the inspection of the orbiter to make sure that we got a good, clean bill of health. And I'll do that again once we've undocked from space station. And then finally, along with Tim Copra, I'll go out and do the 2 spacewalks that are scheduled.
Okay. Give us some background or your best description of the PMM. Kind of tell us, what it looks like and maybe how it differs from a regular multi-purpose logistics module, how it's been outfitted differently to allow it to be a permanent part of space station.
Okay. So the PMM started off its life as an MPLM, a multi-purpose logistics module that we're simply going to attach permanently to the space station. If people aren't familiar with the multi-purpose logistics module, if you've ever seen those pods containers that the people will come and drop off in your driveway to give you extra storage, that's what it is. It's a big Connex for storing things. So we bring up big loads of transfer and we unload that thing, and then we load it back up for things that need to come back to Earth, and we take those things home. Well, this time we're not bringing it back home. The space station needs someplace to store all of its stuff. Just as anybody who's got a house, similar to the junk piles up, and you need some place to store it. Well, we don't have a closet or a big closet, except above the Japanese experiment module. There's a small one up there. We needed something bigger, and that's the point. Is we're taking one of these pods containers, and we're permanently attaching it to the space station. And there's a few things that come with that. These MPLMs, we're only going to be in space for weeks at a time, and you won't worry about things like meteorites or debris hitting it and knocking holes in it. And so in this case, we need to outfit it with micrometeorite debris shielding, much like you see on the Columbus Laboratory, which is about the same dimensions as this PMM that we're going to dock. People will be in there, so you want to have things like communications in there, the ability to have fire alarms ring inside, and things of that nature. I mean, it's a closet, but if you're going to be in there, you need to be able to make it a habitable place. And so they've been doing modifications to this to make it a more permanent structure rather than this temporary addition to the space station that comes up and leaves with each shuttle.
The day after you make it to orbit, you're scheduled to do a limited inspection of the shuttle's exterior on the tiles. Tell us about that procedure and your involvement in it.
Okay. On the second day in flight, Steve Lindsay, Eric Bowe, and I will be the 3 folks who operate the Space Shuttle's robotic arm, mainly to inspect the leading edges of both wings and the nose cap on the shuttle and a few other places around to see if it suffered any damage from debris coming off the external tank during ascent. As you know from the Space Shuttle Columbia mishap, that was what caused that mishap, was a foam hitting the leading edge of one of those wings and knocking a hole in it. So we'll take a package of sensors on a long boom, the orbiter boom sensing system, and get up close images, some of them 3D images and scans of all those vital areas on the outside of the shuttle to make sure our thermal protection is still in place.
Okay. And walk us through rendezvous and docking day, and being sure to touch on the part post-docking where you actually have to start getting the logistics carrier out of the payload band, attaching it.
The third day in space starts off with us chasing down the space station. I think it's several miles away, and what we'll do is we'll get ourselves to a point about 600 feet below the space station. We'll do a quick flip beneath there so they can take some of their high-powered optics and take pictures of the rest of the shuttle that we couldn't inspect with the robot arm. And then we'll continue to fly out about another 400 feet in front of the space station. From there, we'll align our docking port with the space station's docking port in its front and back up onto it in a slow waltz with the space station to do that. Once we've got a good docking and a good airtight seal between us and the space station, we'll, I think even before we open up the hatches and meet the crew, we've got the express logistics carrier, which needs to be ready to come out of the payload bay right away. And so that's going to be a choreographed sequence of events between our robot arm and the space station's robot arm. The logistics carrier sits so far forward in the shuttle's payload bay that when it's docked, the front labs on the space station block the arm's ability to grab it. So we cannot grab that logistics carrier with our own robot arm. And so what will happen is the space station's robot arm will be mounted forward on the space station. I believe it's either the Node 2 or the lab. We'll reach into our payload bay and grab that logistics carrier out. Once it's there, it can't get to where it needs to put that logistics carrier up on the space station truss. So it needs to reposition itself. So once that's out, it will go to a position to hand off to us. We'll take our space station, our space shuttle robot arm, and grapple that logistics carrier. And the space station arm with our two crew members, I believe Nicole Stott and Tim Coper, and they will now have gone through the hatches and gotten aboard the space station, will reposition that arm off of the front of the space station up onto the mobile servicing system, which is just a big rail car. The front face of the truss is a set of railroad tracks, and this thing can trundle up and down these tracks to different work sites. They'll get it on that mobile servicing station, move out to where they need to, where they can reach both the this express logistics carrier and its installation site on board the truss. We will move with the shuttle arm, this carrier, to a point out where the space station arm can get it, and that's called a hand back. We'll hand it back to them. They'll grab it, move it on top of the space station truss, or the bottom of the space station truss, and get it all plugged in. And then we go pick up with the rest of our day, meeting and greeting with the space station crew.
Okay. You and Tim Coper are scheduled to do 2 spacewalks on the mission, as you mentioned. The first one will also be your first spacewalk of your career. Tell us about the anticipation level from that.
Excited about it, and also just a little bit of apprehension because it's something that you want to get exactly right. Spacewalks, as whether in the pool or in space, are challenging, both mentally, physically, and emotionally. They do work you to some of your limits, and so I'm looking forward to that challenge, but I also want to make sure I meet each objective in those spacewalks. And so I'm looking forward to that.
There are 2 EVAs on this mission. You and Tim Coper will go outside and do some things. Kind of give us a big picture overview of what the purposes of the EVAs are.
Okay. For our mission, STS-133, our EVAs are a departure from the standard for our typical shuttle missions to the space station over the last 10 years. Typical profile is you bring up a big chunk of the space station, some module, some component, some segment. The robotic operators go out and position it in place using an arm like a big crane, and the spacewalkers go out there and bolt it down. And like anything like you put on your house, you want plumbing, you want electricity, and increasingly in this century you want data connection. So these guys will go out and put those plumbing lines, those electrical lines, and the data lines up to that particular new piece of the space station. For ours, we've got the PMM, the permanent multi-purpose module, which is like a closet. Closets don't require a lot of plumbing, don't require a lot of data, don't require a lot of electricity. So we were just going to bolt this thing on. However, somewhere along the line in our training flow, we had a nitrogen tank on board the space station. It had a glitch. It wasn't providing nitrogen. And this opened the door for us to have 2 spacewalks on the mission. They were looking to have us go out and either repair or replace this nitrogen tank. That tank, because of some really smart troubleshooting on the ground, got fixed. The task itself would have been more than enough for 1 spacewalk, but not quite enough for 2. And so the space station program put out a casting call for any other tasks that could be added on to fill up the time on the second spacewalk since we're out the door. Found there was a long list of tasks, more than 2 spacewalks worth that were out there. So even though the tank problem itself had gone away, this long list of tasks, none of which would have been important enough on its own to have merited a spacewalk, the conglomerate of them all kind of went over the threshold where it was worth having 2 spacewalks to catch up the space station without using space station assets, without taxing the space station crew members extra time. They have their own scheduled spacewalks, but we're up there, we've got the assets, we've got the people, let's go ahead and go out and do these service repairs on the space station. So it much more resembles what we would call a stage spacewalk, something where the shuttle wouldn't be there, where you're servicing or repairing or outfitting the space station. And those are the two spacewalks that we're going to do. So it's a bunch of, I call them dogs and cats, but no elephants.
Okay. Then go ahead and if you would give us an overview of the task you're going to do on the first spacewalk, EVA-1.
Okay, our first spacewalk that we're going to do, it starts off, and the bulk of that is going to be cleaning up from the last spacewalk that our space station crew members did. Several months ago, we had a ammonia pump for our cooling system fail on board the space station, and we need to go and replace it. That task is very long and involved, and they got the new pump in place. They got the space station in a configuration where it could sustain itself, but the old pump needed to be put away, and a lot of the tools and things that were out there had to be put away too. And the next opportunity to do that was going to be during our spacewalk. So we will start right off with going out to pick up that failed pump and putting it back in the storage location for the replacement pump. It's got a big tent that it goes into, and we'll put it in there and bolt it down. Once that's done, Tim Coper will go off and we'll split up and do different separate tasks. I think our next thing we're going to go do from there is bring in a portable foot restraint. I think of these portable foot restraints as ski bindings to hold us to the space station. There's times when we have to go put a lot of torque or force on the space station to turn a wheel, turn a bolt, and we need something to take that reaction load. Otherwise, we'll just simply go the opposite way because we don't have any weight in space. We've got probably a dozen of these foot restraints in different spots around the space station, and we can unplug them and take them to places. But they need to be updated. There's some new equipment and configurations need to be done. So this one is one of the remaining ones that needs to be brought inside. So we'll grab that one and bring it inside. But first we need to take another foot restraint out there to that spot and plug it in. There's this huge tool stanchions attached to it, and it's not something you want to lug around. So we'll just simply move the short distance to the one that's already fixed, and we'll bring the one that needs updating back into the airlock for repair. Okay. Once we're done with that, we've got a light and camera assembly out on the starboard truss. It gives us great views of the Earth, great views of the stack from out there in the truss, and great views of the solar arrays. However, with this new ELC-4 platform that we're taking out to the space station, a lot of the views outboard are going to be blocked, and a lot of the cameras, its views are blocked by this new platform. In order to recover some of that field of view, we're going to have to take this whole post and cant it inboard about 30 degrees and give you some more views, let you have more views of the Earth, more views of the space station. So we're going to take out a wedge, a big shim, and put it between that light stanchion and the truss itself to hold this thing inboard about 30 degrees. And Tim and I will do that task together. Next thing we're going to do is set up so we can take this mobile service, mobile base system, that arm that sits on based on a rail car, let it go out past the end of the starboard truss 1, S1 truss. It's able to go out into the rotating components of the space station on S3 and outboard, provided there's a linkage in that rail system that lets it go across. So what we're going to do is put up just basically a mini bridge, and they're called rail stubs, that allow the wheels for that rail car to move from the S1 truss outboard onto the S3 truss. And we'll go ahead and clamp those two down. There'll be just two we'll put up there. We've also got some stops out there to physically keep this thing from rolling off the edge of S1 before they had these stubs out there. And they're just on hinges. We simply roll those stops down out of the way and allow that rail car to go inboard and outboard from there. And that's going to be the big part of our task right there. Let's see. And finally, we have a payload from the Japanese Space Agency. It's called Message in a Bottle. We're simply going to open this bottle up and get a sample of the vacuum of space. It's a big thermos bottle, and we open it up and allow it to equalize with the vacuum of space out there, and then we seal it back up. Oddly enough, being out there in space, you've got a better vacuum there that you get here on Earth with any kind of pump, so you really have a more perfect vacuum. We'll get some photographs for the Japanese Space Agency, and we'll bring that in, and that would wrap up our first spacewalk.
And for the second EVA, what's the current plan for that one?
Okay, for the second day's spacewalk, I'll start off on my part to go out to that failed pump module and there's some residual ammonia sitting in that tank. This isn't kind of like the bottle ammonia you have sitting on your sink in the kitchen or your bathroom. This is 100% ammonia. It's pretty noxious stuff, and we don't really want to carry that back down to Earth with us. So what we can do is vent that out into space where it's harmless, and we can bring back an empty tank, empty pump module. So what I'll do is take a vent line that I've already set up on the first day spacewalk when we bring back this failed pump module. I'll connect that vent line to the module itself and close a bail to let it vent itself out into space. And it takes about maybe 90 seconds, 2 minutes for all the ammonia to vent itself overboard. Once that's done, I'll close up and cap that failed module, close up the tent flap behind it, and let it sit until a future mission brings it back to Earth. And then what I'll do is take that those vent tools and those bags that were left over from that original spacewalk, put them back in the original bags, and put them back on top of the airlock where those bags stay for any future times we have to change another pump module or any spacewalk for repair. Once I'm done with that, I'll head out onto what was our normal profile for doing the repairs on the space station. We have that platform, that ELC-4 platform that we're putting out on the S3 truss segment. There's a computer control box. I can't think of a platform needing computer control, but this one does. And it has a thermal blanket on it to keep it from getting overly warm. And, well, it needed that for the launch part, but for sitting in space, it doesn't need that blanket. So I'll go out and grab that blanket and roll it up and put it in a bag. And if you've ever seen Charlie Brown and Linus's blanket, that's the part that worries about me. This blanket suddenly turns ugly and attacks me. We had some bags, I call them jettison stowage bags. They're laundry bags. It's a glorified name for a laundry bag. They're sitting out on one of our CETA carts, one of those hand portable rail carts, sits on the mobile base system. And we'll grab those 3 bags and put them in the same bag as that blanket, and we'll untie them. They were taken out for the pump module repair task by Doug Wheelock and Tracy Caldwell Dyson earlier, and I'll go and clean those up and bring them back in for this one so we can stage them for the next task by the time we go outside. Okay. Once that's done, I'll go over to the port side of the truss segment. There is a working light that we can put inside for people who do work inside the truss, because it's obviously dark even when the sun's up. And it's called a CETA light. And I will take that light out there and install that one and get it plugged in, and then they can do a quick power check while I'm out there. That'll be on S3. I'll come inboard from that task and go up to the very roof of that truss segment on S1, where S1 meets the rotating components from S3. There is one of the boxes out there has a connector to it, a big data connector, and the bale itself needs to be shielded from sunlight so it doesn't get too hot or too cold. Some of that shielding, that blanket, has peeled away, and the program's concerned that it's getting sunlight and it's getting put through, getting too hot. I'll simply take that blanket, put it back over top of the connector, and use a wire tie. It's a coat hanger, really that's all it is, and wrap it around that to hold it down so it doesn't peel back again. Take a quick picture of it so people can see it's in a proper configuration, and then I'll head down to the underside of that same truss, on the earth side of it, and where we've got these basically receivers for these grapple bars that go on the radiators. The radiators themselves, they fold out like accordions, and if they're folded up, in order to move and install them for replacement, they've got this big, it's like a double Y-shaped beam that allows you to grapple. It itself ties to the radiators, and it has a grapple fixture on it so the robot arm can grapple to it. Well, when you've got the radiator deployed, you need some place to park that grapple beam. And so we've got these stowage receptacles for it. And on a previous spacewalk, they went out there and tried to bolt them down, and the bolts just wouldn't sit quite, so they're wobbly. My job is to go out there and take a look at it, do some troubleshooting to see if we can figure out why these things aren't cinched down as tightly as they'd like them cinched, and if I can, fix it so that they are cinched down where they need to be. I'll look at both those beams, and when I'm done with that task, I'll head over to Node 3, the newest module on the space station, where we have a row of connectors on the very portmost side of it, the outboard side of that module. There's a blanket over top of it, and we'd like to remove that blanket so we can have access to all of the power and data connections out there for future missions. And so it's just a strip of cloth, maybe about 3 or 4 feet long. I'll roll that up and put it into the bag and make off with that. I think once that's done, I'll head back to the airlock and drop that bag off, pick up a lens cover to put onto one of our cameras. The glass itself, we'd like something that we can replace, so if it gets pitted or scratched, you don't have to bring the whole camera home. This one sits up on top of that mobile base system up on the very front face of the space station. It's called a POA. Don't ask me what the POA stands for, but it's a fixed receptacle that you can bring modules in, and it'll grapple to them the same way that the robot arm grapples to an object. And that's where we had that failed pump module. It sits there until we do our spacewalk to remove it. I'm going to go out on the camera on that one and simply put a protective lens cover over top of it, and then head back down to the airlock with Tim, and that should wrap up our second spacewalk.
After your work on station is complete, you will undock and prepare for the trip back to Earth. It might be one of the last opportunities for anybody to see a space station from the vantage point of inside of a shuttle while backing away. As you sit here today trying to imagine that moment, what goes through your head about the profoundness of that?
A little bit sad, also a little bit happy that the space shuttle has done such good things, to be able to be one of those lucky people to get to see that from the shuttle. Uppermost in my mind, I know when I'm there doing it, because the same thing last time I backed away from the space station was get the pictures. Yeah. You want to have some really good shots to bring back to everybody of that. It's the only chance you get to see certain parts of the space station is the camera shots we take while we're undocking and flying away. It's also some of the big, photographic moments, things that people really want to see. They're really gorgeous shots you get of the space station, and it's nice to be able to share those views with people on the ground. So I'm going to have a camera handy and all my battery of lenses out there and try and get good shots of the space station as we're walking and getting away. So it's not just me trying to describe how beautiful it was when I pulled away. People will see it with their own 2 eyes.
Okay. This mission is scheduled to be one of the last space shuttle missions. What does it mean to you to have had a part in the space shuttle program?
I didn't appreciate how lucky I was to be in the space shuttle program when I first got here. I was just happy to be an astronaut and being in the space program, and the shuttle was a way to get into space. In our space program, we've been in space now for, since the late 50s, early 60s. We've only had one program with a hypersonic reentry vehicle that landed like an airplane and had the capability of a shuttle. No other spacecraft I know of have robot arms. No other spacecraft out there, come back into the atmosphere and land like an airplane, take off like a rocket, and do the things that the space shuttle does. And I don't know we're going to get there for a very long time. It was a pretty bold and audacious thing we did back in the 60s and 70s to build such a spacecraft. And to have been one of the people who got to be a crew member on board, something with that type of capability, it's a privilege. I just assumed that once the shuttle was done flying that we would have something bigger and more capable that would take us further, shuttles that might go to the moon or something like that. But we've gone the other way. We're going to capsules. And of course, they don't necessarily need something as big and complex for what we have envisioned for NASA out in the future. And I understand that, but visually, you understand that we're not going to have something that's as cool as the shuttle was. It's more practical.
Okay. This is also scheduled to be the last flight of Space Shuttle Discovery. It's the most accomplished shuttle in the shuttle fleet. If you had to compile a list of Discovery's greatest hits, missions, activities, events it's been involved in, which ones come to mind that you would say would definitely have to be on that list?
Well, understand that I have the perspective of a test pilot, and the holy grail if you're a test pilot is to fly the first mission of anything. Anytime a brand new airplane comes out, you want to go fly that first flight. Or if you take some new configuration, you want to be the one to take it up for the first time to go see, will it work? Mm-hmm. Or discover something new that nobody's seen before. And so given that, and Discovery's past, and understand that Columbia was the first shuttle to actually fly. But Discovery was the very first shuttle to fly after we lost Challenger. After we completely reconfigured the solid rocket motors and the configuration of the space shuttle. The first one to go out there and tiptoe back out there were the crew aboard Discovery. Likewise, after we lost Columbia several years ago, the first shuttle to fly back in space again was Discovery. And we learned a lot from that. So we grounded ourselves again because we discovered a lot of things that were still problems with that, with what we were trying to fix. And so we had a second first flight. And again, a year later, on STS-121, was again Discovery. This was the one that was out there assuming the risks, exploring the unknown with these crews aboard. And I would say, for me at least, those are the most significant accomplishments aboard Discovery. Was because each time this thing flew, it was a brand new shuttle. And it looked externally like the old shuttles we had before, but we had done extensive remodeling and refitting and reconfiguring. And every time you do that, there's an opportunity for things to go wrong. You have untested and unproven systems, and you got to go shake those out. So those are probably some of the most dangerous missions that we flew. Clearly some of the most ambitious and daring ones, and each one of those times it was Discovery was the one that was making that voyage.
How would you characterize what Space Shuttle has meant to the advancement of human space exploration?
Space Shuttle was, again, the most ambitious, most complex vehicle that we've ever built. The Soviet Union tried hard to make their own version of a space shuttle. Never got a single person in space aboard that shuttle itself. They flew it unmanned for one orbit around the Earth and landed it, and then they were done. It tells you how difficult it was to have pulled it off in the first place. By the time we're done here, we'll have had 134 missions aboard this particular shuttle. We'll have built the largest, most complex structure that's ever been put up in orbit ever. We'll have put up the Hubble telescope. We'll have done just things that we never would have thought the shuttle was capable of doing, even when we designed it back in the 1970s. It's set the bar. It set the expectations of what we can do in space. When we first put the shuttle up, or designed this thing, we had just gone to the moon. And that was about it. We had a few capsules gone up in space and splashed back down. We had a few communication satellites up in orbit. But routine access to space was something for science fiction writers. And now it's not. You have a whole generation of people. Now, if you were born back when we first started doing the shuttle, you'd have your own kids. And so you and your children would have grown up with the expectation that, of course, we routinely go into space and we do things like put up space stations and space telescopes.